implications of it. I'm joined by Mr. Burzine Waghmar, Visiting Fellow, Royal United Services Institute in London. Mr. Waghmar, welcome to DD India this evening. Extremely important meeting there of the G7 group foreign ministers. We just listed out what the communique said. For you, what have been the big takeaways of this meeting?
You have adequately listed out what were the main bullet points at Nagano in anticipation of what will occur next month at the 49th G7 summit in Hiroshima, when the said seven heads of states meet. But let me come in here right away to talk about what are the implications for New Delhi.
Yeah.
Well, first things first, there can be no impunity for war crimes was rightly put out by Foreign Minister Hayashi and Secretary Blinken among the other members in the final communique, which was regrettably missing in the March G20 meeting in New Delhi because no agreement could be reached on wording in condemning Russia for this outright naked aggression. That has taken place here now, and quite rightly so. Then, point number two, Putin's threats to actually install short-range tactical weapons in Belarus comes on the heels of a new spring offensive, which we will see in all likelihood being conducted by Ukraine, and justifiably so. But for now, Russians of India, China is a clear and present danger. The insecurity is no mere fiction. It looms large on India's borders. It is very tangible. He doesn't seem to simply get that. He can't get his head around it. And he thinks that Russia, India, China can all get along well and can, put up two thumbs to the West and the rest of it. That is simply not on.
But Mr. Waghmar, yeah, Mr. Waghmar, the fact that New Delhi might be having a different foreign policy when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Beijing has been very vocal about its support to Russia. It, of course, has said that, China will not be providing arms and ammunition to Russia, but clearly Russia has a support system when it comes to China.
It does, and even on the eve of the war, as I've pointed out elsewhere, 24 hours before the war started, Shreya, now we do know that Chinese intelligence services were jamming Ukraine's systems, state railways, bank services, and the rest of it. And quite frankly, Putin and Xi had some sort of weird, sinister arrangement. Of course, I can't pinpoint with actual proof here on air, but we do know that the invasion was held back so as to not steal Moscow's thunder with the Winter Games, China's thunder with the Winter Games ending. So Putin allowed him that before invading on Thursday morning, February 24th. So China's contention that it wants to be a peace broker with President Zelensky and the arrest simply doesn't fly in the face of realities, because nowhere in the so-called wording that China put out a fortnight ago is there any mention of Russia evacuating illegal territory which is de facto, de jure sovereign territory of the Republic of Ukraine. And if that's not on, which clearly it is not in the prose, then there is nothing for Kyiv to discuss. So China's intents are disingenuous, to say the least. Could I just come back again to the Russia factor here? Moscow has delayed sending the S-400s to New Delhi. So what can you count upon in the future is a question. And for the first time in the 76-year republic of India's history, India's Russian weaponry dependency has gone down from what used to be over 50% to 45% of Russian weaponry is now part of India's arsenal. So that shows you the trend of things to come. And this is going to be a conundrum, at least for those who would like to see it otherwise, in New Delhi and Moscow, because the relationship has purely disintegrated into a transactional sort. Indo-Russian trade is not more than $11 billion, a paltry sum to say the least. It has never crossed beyond that. Russia, it is true, does supply India with oil, potash, and everything else that it tends to every so now and often ask for. But the question is, as Russia gets sucked into China's vortex, which of course it is, because a desperate Putin is dependent on China, China is the only one who's going to buy his natural gas from the Siberian fields, which of course it's doing. And as Putin's balance of payments falters, the entire Siberian seaboard and the hinterland, gas and mineral-rich hinterland, is for China's taking, and Putin will feel the pinch. He will have to kowtow to China.
Okay.
And if that happens, what is going to happen? You think you can count on Moscow in times to come? I seriously doubt it. And I do know some in the South Bloc zone have started realizing that Russia cannot be counted on for everything for all times as a dependable ally in times to come, as it's more desperate with the Ukraine imbroglio.
Okay, personally, Mr. Burzine, I feel that India has very carefully and smoothly paved her way through this Russia-Ukraine conflict and balanced what it had to. But when it comes to China, we've had a very strong statement from the G7 foreign ministers meeting come out. They've called on China for not just the human rights abuses in Xinjiang or the autonomy of Hong Kong and Tibet. They've also said that China needs to uphold the principles of the UN Charter and maintain a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific region. So really strong words for the increasing Chinese aggression as well. Indeed.
I couldn't concur more. As Foreign Minister Hayashi said, Ukraine today, East Asia tomorrow. That is not an empty threat. And there are some detractors of Japan and South Korea and Taiwan who may like to think, whether in India or elsewhere across the global South sphere, that this is simply to raise a bogey in order to get weapons from the US or Western attention is simply not true. Because it is not fair to point that out, and it is downright disingenuous again to do so, because they do not realize the clear and present danger and palpable threat that Japan, South Korea and Taiwan truly feel, and not just from North Korea, but also the Chinese card that comes into play here as such.
Yeah, and adding to this, Mr. Waghmar, the issue of Taiwan Strait, the kind of action that we have seen in the recent days there in the G7, really calling that out as well, and asking China to maintain peace and stability there as well. Clearly, marking the fact that the world will be looking at the situation very closely, and that we do not want another Russia-Ukraine kind of a situation here as well.
Indeed. And again, to go back to what Foreign Minister Hayashi said about Taiwan, it is important to note that what Xi Jinping finds galling, now that he's president for life for a third term, is that Taiwan continues as a flourishing, robust democracy. And that is a threat to the mainland Politburo and for the autocracy that they represent since 1949. That is, of course, all very well to talk about one China policy and an eternal China. That's all fine, but that is debatable because there is such a thing as a Taiwanese identity that has crystallized in the last 7 decades. But it is Taiwan's robust democracy and liberals' normative rules-based system which Xi Jinping and the Peking Politburo find audacious and cannot stand, because obviously it is a threat to them at home and those at home who would ask for greater freedoms. That cannot ever be factored out.
Right. Another important issue at hand, Mr. Waghmar, and perhaps the world has shifted its focus because of the kind of crises that we have seen in the last few years, is the issue of Afghanistan and the rights of women there. And the G7 has also called on Taliban there to have a more inclusive rule there in the country, irrespective of gender, caste or political beliefs. Do you see that really happening in Afghanistan anytime soon? Absolutely not.
And again, let's bring the Chinese factor here. The Taliban signed a deal for an Amu Darya oil basin with the Chinese, one of the first deals that this so-called government has signed, only to have a Chinese-run hotel in Kabul blasted to smithereens by IS, and the Taliban couldn't do anything about it. So once again, China must find itself in a quandary, which indeed it does, because Pakistan blows hot and blows cold with militants, as the record amply attests. And Pakistan is not in a position anymore even to contain this Taliban 2.0. So China is really left scratching its head, Shreya, on so many counts. Number one, why did Putin have this war? And what is its end game and purpose? They are privately asking it, despite showing us a semblance of unity with Xi Jinping in Moscow and calling him a dear friend and limitless friendship and, you know, all of that as such. The Chinese privately still ask, what was the purpose for this war and what is its end game? Point number 2, with Pakistan, as to how is Pakistan going to pan out, given how the situation is currently and it's spiraling out of control with the local discontent and instability, and Pakistan's spillover effect into Afghanistan, of course, with this Taliban, who clearly are a pariah, rightly so, and cannot be controlled as well. So once the chips falls, China has still to work out how things will pan out for itself. I mean, it may claim a minor victory, Shreya, and I could like to bring this in here with being a broker for Saudi Arabia and Iran, but I wouldn't really set much store by it because, Shreya, Saudi Arabia and the other GCC sheikdoms are merely hedging their interests. That's statecraft for you. At the end of the day, they are not going to burn their bridges with Washington because they still look upon DC as the main ally to support these regimes there. China is not going to step into the vacuum, and China doesn't have the appetite or the intention to pick up the slack which Washington has held since 1945 in the Middle East.
You know, on climate change, Mr. Waghmar, the G7 has urged countries to fulfill their climate commitments and achieve their net zero emission targets. But I can't help see the irony of it, because climate action has been witnessing a developed versus developing countries tussle. And we know that the developed nations are contributing more when it comes to, emissions. Do you see, how do you see this really panning out and really getting resolved when it comes to the G7 countries, the rich nations, urging the rest of the world to fulfill their climate commitments?
It will be seen in context of what will happen in Hiroshima next month, but also in New Delhi in September. The question is, there are commitments made, like Sunak administration, for instance, and others across the Western Hemisphere. And there will be a lot of bargaining on that front. That is never going to really be resolved right away in the near-term future, but only the medium-term future. Taking the can to the long grass is not an option that may play out for quite a while, but like I said, it's to be seen. But of course, India did manage a diplomatic victory at Sharm el-Sheikh with the COP27, as you remember, in getting wording inked, as it were, last October. So that is something to be said to for India and its commitment. Coming on the heels of September 2022, Shreya, where of course Prime Minister Modi said publicly on air to a very visibly discomforted Putin that today's era is not an era of war, and I have spoken to you on the phone about this repeatedly.
Yeah, in this kind of a geopolitical change that we have been witnessing since the past more than a year now, how do you see the G7 really panning out in the future, Mr. Waghmar? And do you see it being an impactful, a strong, impactful grouping for the entire world?
Oh, yes, it will. Because make no mistake, it may seem at first sight as a rich man's club. Yeah. But the G7 does have impactful policies. There is talk now, Shreya, and the G7 has been doing it for the last few summits to expand developmental aid for the Pacific region and other parts of the global south in order to combat China's predatory tactics as part of the BRI that we've seen across Africa and parts of Asia. So the G7 is committed to that, and only a few days ago, former Prime Minister Cameron mentioned that we in the West need to dig deeper into our pockets in order to support so many of these countries, in order to forestall Chinese designs and incursions on them. So this is already occurring as we speak. It's something which the G7 realizes. And please note that G7 funding is far and away more transparent and accountable than what passes for murky dealings with China and the said administration in place in any part of the Pacific or Africa, where they tend to manipulate elections, politicians and the like.
All right, we'll leave it there, Mr. Burzine Waghmar. Thank you very much for joining us on DD India this evening and sharing your perspective on the big takeaways and the significance of the G7 foreign ministers meeting. Thank you very much.